How's everybody doing out there? Good lunch? All right. Well, we have a great opportunity this afternoon, and obviously the whole day. I was in here for the early part of the morning, but let me kick this panel off with a little introduction and a little frame of reference. I know some of you, but my name's Daniel Lewin, who's probably in the program. I'm the CEO of the Computer History Museum. It's just been 1 year that I've been here after over 40 years in this business of computing and technology, all in the Bay Area. And personally, I came about this role based upon a personal interest in what's going on in the industry. We've got two great panelists, which we'll introduce in a moment, but by way of background, the Computer History Museum is this place that over the course of 40 plus years has collected the definitive artifact set of the computer industry, all the hardware and all the software as well. But perhaps more important, all the oral histories. There's well over 1,000 of them in our inventory of people who invented all the things that we live and breathe and deal with every day. And the challenge is that computing is now ambient. It's everywhere. It's not a thing anymore. And the phenomenon that we're struggling with at the museum, which is why I'm here, and this panel is particularly interesting to me because of it, and this whole program is interesting because of it, is that we've entered this new phase at the museum where it's really not about the stuff anymore, it's about the implications of the stuff. And so the Computer History Museum is also CHM, and the way we're framing it is computing humanity in meaning, and then asking the question, what does it mean to be a human in a world that doesn't exist without computing? And I think this conference and the partnerships that we have with people who like to come here for their programs is really, this is a milestone event for us to be partnering with Common Sense. I've worked with Jim and the team going back to the early 1980s. Actually, I ran the education business at Apple and was part of the team that launched the Macintosh originally and part of the founding group at Next, and Next Step is the OS at Apple. So there's a lot of discussion this morning about Apple and their opportunity and Tristan's remarks. But we've got two world-class panelists here who are going to riff a little bit on some of the fundamental issues about ethical tech. And both have played immense roles in different ways in evolving the industry. Craig involved, obviously, with Craigslist, and that needs no explanation. Tim, one of the fundamental investors in the whole mobile revolution. And sort of one of the leaders going back 10, 12 years or more, when I think I met you probably 16, 17 years ago on this front. And they've got, I think, really, really strong points of view about what's going on. I'm going to stop in a moment, but I would postulate that we've entered this place, and again, it was referenced earlier in the day, where there's a phase change that's going on, a fundamental phase change. And the analogy that I like is that we all know about water. It's been a little wet here in the Bay Area lately, which is great. But it also, in the same chemical makeup, is ice and vapor. And we're entering this place where it could get really cold or it could get really hot. And in fact, both things are going on at the same time. And we're used to water, is I guess the way I would describe it. But we're having these two extremes happening at the same time in terms of the tech industry and the monetization issues, and obviously the attention-based business models. So as we talk about ethical tech, one of the framing questions that I'd like to tee up right here is, here we sit in the museum where there's 4 decades plus of collections of these artifacts. Each of you, well, let's start with Craig on the far side. What do you think is going on, and is this a fundamental turning point?
We are seeing what I prefer to call a singularity. I'm a wannabe physicist, like a lot of people who went into computer sciences. Things are changing at an accelerating pace. The rules are changing very visibly. particularly in the areas including politics. No one predicted it, not specifically. No one knows how it's going to work out, but things are changing. From my point of view, that's kind of exciting because as a 1950s-style nerd, I've been trained for this for about 60 years, and I feel ready to help invent the future, focusing on some of the most important areas, like when it comes to online behavior, what's ethical, what's trustworthy, what are some of the big issues to focus on. Now, I can go on indefinitely along those lines, worried only that I might pre-announce some things starting tomorrow, going through next week. So I figure this is time for me to shut up for a moment.
We'll bring that back around in a minute, though. We'd like to hear more. So, Tim, from your vantage point, where are we? Is this a fundamental turning point? What do you see?
Oh, yeah. I view this as final exam period for humanity in many ways. But there's three vectors I want to highlight. If we look at Computer History Museum, in the last 50 years of computing, the history of this is we used to create technologies for other technologists, whether it was for research or things like that. It was pieces for other techies. Then technology shifted into tools and software for businesses. Today, we build technology that touches every human being on the planet. That requires a certain level of ethical understanding with what we're building. Because the thing is, tech ain't good or bad. It's just a tool. Therefore, what matters most is the intention or energy we wield it with. That's what we should be looking at now. None of us, even as investors or founders, have ever asked the question, yes, this can make money. Should we? Should this exist? Mm-hmm. And so really, there's the buck stops here. The buck starts here as a venture capitalist. And for the first time, we're starting to ask questions of, this anonymous student messaging app could make a ton of money, but should this exist? Is it good for people? It's led us to pass on deals like Yik Yak and other things where, I'm a firm believer anonymous networks just are not good for humanity. Nothing good happens in the dark in general. Mm-hmm. I'm now even coming around on things like free speech. I think that free speech without accountability is bad in general when it can be just exacerbated by technology. And so I see that we've actually unintentionally built the matrix from that movie, but it's not an evil AI overlord. It's just a business model of free ad-based economics. The inevitable outcome is, if attention is the product, you will build algorithms that hack that. And human behavior is ultimately programmable because we're battling our biology hardwired in there from when we're running around the steppes of Africa because we have a core mandate of eat, don't get eaten, pass on your genes. That pretty much explains all human behavior because in any given moment, you're evaluating constantly, should I feed on it, fuck it, fight it, flee from it, or friend or follow it. And because of that, with an ad-based business model, you poke at those fear centers to get people's attention. That's the inevitable outcome. Right. So we basically need new business models and new metrics of well-being if we want to make tech that provides well-being.
Yeah, it's a fascinating framing for I think, everyone in the room. And I'm glad you went there because it's true. And it's good to be able to speak truth at a forum like this. So you made a comment that we're actually... and I think it's the essence of the conversation that we are in the process of programming billions of robots right now, and they are us. The question is, how are we programming those robots, and who's programming the algorithm and that's leading us to water? So, Craig, what do you think?
Well, I take a less deterministic view of humanity. I do believe in this thing called free will, that we can be influenced. I do see that the social media platforms can be manipulated to influence people, but I'm focusing more on working with the platforms and working with news organizations and ethics organizations directly to figure out what works, what doesn't, how do you help out. We only have a short amount of time here, but right now I'm focusing on what happened in 2016 through now, because, as Mr. Mueller reminds us, we do have very hostile, very smart foreign adversaries screwing around with Western democracy, and it's up to people of goodwill to fight back about that. And that's happening now at the platforms, it's happening in news organizations, and then sometimes there's just old cranky nerds who are helping out.
Yeah. Well, there's a change, innovation as a concept. People toss the word around a lot. I'd like to pause for that just for a moment. I mean, it's one thing to invent something new, a mousetrap, and if there's no mice to be caught, then it's not useful, right? But innovation is about structural change. And typically in the venture industry in particular, it's tied to economics. And that has been the lowest common denominator, the greatest possible return. How do we inject, at least from a venture perspective, Tim, how do we interject? Where do the regulations, where do the new controls come in? And is it at the GP level? Is it at the limited level? Is it at the level of a nation state? Witness what's happened in Europe with the GDPR, and there's a push, obviously, in California, and sort of this bubbling up discussion about some level of regulation and human conditions. So, what do you think from the venture industry's perspective?
Regulation never keeps pace with technology because not enough regulators are tech savvy to even know what the questions are. As a result, it has to start from business. And so we just had our limited partner meeting. Always follow the dollars. Money is not just a store of value, it's a store of energy, karma, if you will. So the intentions behind that energy lead to the expectations you place upon it. If our limited partners only say, get me the most returns, what am I incentivized to do? Go fund things that only make money. But I implored even our limited partners to ask the general partners they invest in, asking them, is this good for society just because it can make a buck? Again, we've never asked those questions before. We're starting to see the rise of impact investing and those sorts of things, but I don't want to see it as just impact equals nonprofit investing. It should be even for-profit investors asking questions of, is this good for humanity? Is this good for our well-being? I'm asking them of our founders, right? Because again, founders, they build companies which are an extension of their values, their personalities, probably their core wounds and traumas they haven't resolved. And so do they understand that? That's what I'm asking founders these days. Take them on a walk and say, do you know your core wound? Why are you building this thing? Fame, fortune, validation, what is it, right?
Yeah.
And so that extends very much into the heart of, are you building Uber or are you building Lyft? And what's the spirit behind that?
The philosophy. So you see that as part of the governance? Is it tied to the individual, or is it institutionally built into the structure of the entity? Right?
I'd like to see it built.
Because the question is, are there good corporations or bad corporations, or are they just, how do they operate? Or is there a company that's good to do business with, if you will?
Right. Could we create ethical guidelines, checklists, compliance in that dimension? Again, ties to, do we have metrics and economic models of well-being too?
Mm-hmm. Craig, what do you think about that?
A couple things asked there. At the same time, the role of government, right now there are some positive things people can do. And I'm working with people in Washington, but more importantly in Sacramento. The deal is that things are too toxic in Washington right now. I do speak to people of good conscience there, but in California, there's a much higher probability that there's a critical mass of honest people who will do good things regarding data privacy, platforms, and so on. The idea is to be pragmatic and to focus on good things that could work. Part of the problem is that, as a rule, and I'm speaking now on behalf of all software developers, but typically we want to do the right thing. Typically, we want to do the don't be evil thing. But often, when we say that, the lawyers say, here's a bunch of reasons you can't do that. The lawyers, there's a bunch of things. The lawyers typically say, Delaware corporate law says you got to maximize dollar return for shareholders. But I've been talking to a guy in business social responsibility at NYU, a guy named Michael Posner, and he's saying that perspective is actually not law or even much of legal interpretation. It's more just opinion and convention starting in around 1970. That is, Delaware corporations who are chartered in Delaware don't have to maximize return for shareholders. They don't have to do it in the short term. Instead, they can maximize return, both in dollars but also socially, and they can focus on the long term. This is beginning to be a trend. The article expressing this opinion is new. You could look it up searching for Posner, P-O-S-N-E-R, Ethiopia, and in Forbes magazine. So the deal is that things are changing right now. We do see the beginning of considerable change, and from my personal parochial point of view, since I'm speaking on behalf of all software developers now, it's time to free the nerds.
Free the nerds, okay. You bring up a question, in my mind, about, again, operating governance. It seems like a fair amount of this activity has blossomed in a U.S.-centric way with U.S. law in terms of the main drivers of the concerns that we have. The platforms that have been built have been U.S.-centric. We are the home of free speech, right? And the question of corporate governance, if you interleave that with the fact that some of the companies that you all just named are actually controlled companies. And if, for those who generally don't know what that means, it means that the voting shares are in the hands of a very, 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 very small number of people, in some cases one. And so what does that mean? I mean, because you're going down this path, and I think that might be something for everyone to think about.
Yep.
Because, again, financiers either allow for those things or not, and in some cases, the money that went into companies that allowed that was not U.S. money.
Right. So I got a little thing I want to bounce off you guys. I was thinking, how do we fix this stuff? Because a lot of it is due to short-time expectations. The quarterly cycle makes no sense if you're trying to build something sustainable, right? You have activist shareholders trying to do all this financial engineering. I thought one way we could fix it is, what if we hack the cap table and also the types of board seats required? We have movement now to have women board members as independents. Yep. What if we change that more? And I was trying to come up with acronyms, so the best I came up with is my name, TIM. So I think the first one is timeline. Stretch it out. If it was on longer cycles, like what we're seeing with the long-term stock exchange, does that change behaviors versus short-term quarterly behaviors? The second is more inclusion and diversity. So that's women, people of race, represented as stakeholders on the cap table at the board. The third is Mother Nature. How would we have an advocate for nature, the ecology around ourselves? Nature has no stakeholder at board meetings. If the voice of the future, of other marginalized people, of longer timelines, of nature itself, could be represented as stakeholders, how would that change the discussion and behaviors of a board meeting of a corporation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's an interesting set of questions. Anyone else? Just the full life cycle of a product, the deconstruction as well as the construction and the environmental impact, the full footprint is really what you're getting at?
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Craig, you had a point of view on that?
Well, I don't invest. It's never ended well for me. I do a lot of contributions in the nonprofit world. For example, recently focusing on centers of excellence for journalism ethics, because I want to address the issues including, should a news outlet, or for that matter, should a social media platform amplify disinformation? Like when they got a guy who's lying, should they make it worse? And what can you do about that? I'm referring to the professionals on that. So what I've said about doing is focusing in areas that I believe in, which I think matter a great deal. Because if you want to protect the country, you focus on trustworthy journalism, cybersecurity, and information warfare, and you contribute a great deal to that. But there's other people, too, who protect the country. So I'm working with a lot of vets organizations and military families organizations. Tonight, on another subject, or maybe tomorrow night, in New York, we're hosting the Women's Startup Challenge, which basically finds the number of startups run by women and then fund the ones who can present best to venture capitalists, but also get a lot of them networked into that whole larger network of venture capitalists. Finally, even today made great strides with voter protection and preventing or minimizing gerrymandering. The deal is these are not political things. These are about protecting the country, so that's what to focus on. You know, there's other things I'll support. If you want, ask me later about pigeon protection, and that pigeon pants are a thing. And you want the pigeon to be wearing them before they fly on your shoulder. Seriously.
Yeah,
You don't want to learn that the hard way.
Right.
But I prefer to learn things the hard way.
Right. So in the world of electioning, you sort of brought up the issues associated with that. Do you think? I mean, it's more or less proven that paper ballots are the most secure. So is there something that you think could emerge in our society on electioning that would be effective from a technological point of view?
Right now, in the next year or two, technology is probably more of a threat to secure, fair voting than it's a help. And so right now, something, let's see, I'm working with what they call the Global Cyber Alliance. The idea there is to provide cybersecurity toolkits for journalists in general, because journalists are under threat. They're getting killed in a lot of the world. But also providing cybersecurity toolkits for election officials. Because right now, if you have a laptop, and if you haven't protected it against phishing or other areas, you're potentially screwed. So the deal is to help election officials prevent election interference from foreign adversaries, also their domestic allies, because right now in this country, the domestic allies of hostile military operations, they are more of a danger in the U.S. In Europe, the same entities which present as foreign to us are attacking the Europeans. You were asking, too, about free speech.
Right.
Free speech is perceived as different in the U.S. versus the U.K. versus the EU. This is a big deal. The fundamental issue that's challenging us is that yelling fire in a crowded theater, lying to people, bearing false witness, that's not free speech. Fraud is not considered free speech. Disinformation is not considered free speech, and I think that's the direction which will be useful when it comes to the platforms making good decisions about things like fake videos. Mm-hmm. I better stop there.
No, it's an important topic, obviously going back to Photoshop, right? And even going back into the 60s with the doctored photographs that were published in major national magazines in and around the Kennedy assassination. So these days, it's much simpler and more straightforward and more sophisticated. Tim, just another attempt at sort of picking on the venture industry as not all businesses are venture-backed, but those that are typically, aimed at super high growth and scale, and anything that can be done at scale, especially with technology and information, can be weaponized. And that's the problem, if you will. Do you think there are any kind of regulations that say at an organizational or at a national level, say the NVCA, the National Venture Capital Association, or others, where is that conversation bubbling around in the community? Because not really?
Not yet, but that's why I'm really interested in, for example, IEEE is trying to drive frameworks for metrics of well-being. We only optimize what we measure, so let's start fixing what we measure. Can we define new frameworks of what well-being are? If those get baked into the business model, then places like NVCA have somewhere to start from to say, oh, with this new framework of economics of well-being, that should be baked into a fund in addition to its IRR, its cash-on-cash returns. Mm-hmm. So it's all about metrics. It's all about business models. I'll always go back to that because that's usually, it's about where the dollars come from and how they're deployed.
Right. So I'm curious if there's any, in terms of our schedule here, how much time, and if there's room for any audience questions. I see a hand in the back. 5 minutes? Okay, let's take a couple questions if there's anyone in the audience that wants to tee up. I see a hand over there.
So you said you need a new business model. You have me in mind.
Yes, absolutely.
Second of all, given the entrenched interest, even if you had one,
I believe so. The time is right. I think the zeitgeist is now of the point. Tristan's done a great job ringing the alarm bells. People are receptive to a message. Here's one of my favorites. We are now in a neural hacking warfare age where people are battling to program our behavior. all the corporations of the top AI talent building the best bots and algorithms to hack your attention. We now need Norton or McAfee of counter-cognitive hacking. All the public deserves neural agents and cognitive prophylactics to be able to understand all the algorithms working on them. Your human willpower and knowledge is not enough. It'll never be enough. You need AI on your side as your advocate, counter-hacking those hackers. That's a business model that could use the McAfee Norton subscription model.
That'd be good.
Right? Another one, I was just going to say really quickly, all of technology has been created to make things cheaper, better, faster, free, all about convenience. The problem with that is we can't resist those impulses. We will now pay for digital coaches to help us manage our impulses by taking things away from us. These will be like digital nannies in essence, but we'll pay because we're investing in ourselves. The one business model is you always pay to invest in yourself, to become the aspirational self you want to be.
That's very good. Another one over there.
Robert Lustig, San Francisco, UCSF. Mr. Newmark, you mentioned that propaganda is not free speech. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court disagrees with you because of a ruling back in 1980, around that same time, called Central Hudson, in which it said that commercial speech is free speech, even if it's propaganda, unless the government has a vested interest in its outcome, and that it's narrowly tailored to fit it. So my question to you is, given that the Supreme Court weighed in on this 5-4 back in 1980, how do we ultimately draw the line between what is marketing, which is using information to espouse your point of view, versus propaganda, which is using disinformation to espouse your point of view, since propaganda is free speech?
I have to disagree with your premise. Propaganda and disinformation are different things. They overlap. The purpose of disinformation is deliberately deceptive, much like fraud is. And I don't think the Supreme Court legitimized fraud. The solution is already in process. People are building networks of fact checkers, people focusing on analyzing networks of disinformation, using often machine learning to disrupt those networks. Meanwhile, journalism ethicists are figuring out just how to express in journalism codes what's wrong with amplifying disinformation, and then how do you do it effectively, which is a big tangent, so I'll stop with that part. The thing is that people are working on these things. People are working on machine learning to detect disinformation, both to track it to its source and then to upon a person's choice if they choose to stop disinformation from ever reaching them. The machine learning market is alive and well and already well underway. I will avoid using the term AI since it's either a marketing term or a term that refers to a far future variety of consciousness. But then I'd like to conclude by saying that Westworld explores that pretty well, and it actually had a theory of that, and I'm a Bernard.
Great. Maybe we'll leave it with that. I think we're ready to move on to the next program. All right, great. Thank the panelists with me. Thanks so much.